I thought nothing hurt worse than losing my mother, until the day my own father looked me in the eyes and said, "Your mother never loved you, and my half-brother." He laughed as he signed away our family farm, my mother's last gift. I stood there alone on her land, realizing I never had a family, and when I gave it all to strangers, leaving my father and brother with nothing, only then did they understand what abandonment feels like. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next stories we bring to life. The call came just after midnight. Charlotte was still awake, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of her apartment, her back pressed against the cool cabinet doors, surrounded by paperwork she hadn't touched in hours. Her phone vibrated silently beside her knee screen, lighting up in the dark. The caller ID read Evanston County Hospital. She didn't answer right away. Somewhere deep down she already knew. When she finally pressed accept, the voice on the other end was soft, rehearsed. "Miss Lawson, I'm sorry to inform you." Charlotte didn't remember the rest, just silence thick as smoke. The next morning she drove. No suitcase, no change of clothes, just herself and the sound of tires against pavement. 3 hours of empty highway past silos and frostbitten fields to a place she hadn't seen in 2 years. Not since the last fight with her mother, the kind of argument where doors slammed harder than hearts did. She thought coming back would feel heavier. Instead, it felt numb. The white fence appeared first, chipping and cracked. The mailbox still leaned to one side. She parked by instinct, same spot as always, under the dead oak tree by the shed. And for a long moment, Charlotte didn't move. The old farmhouse stood ahead, smaller than she remembered. Paint peeled from the siding. The screen door hung crooked. Yet nothing had changed. She stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and walked. The air smelled like hay and diesel, a scent from another life. Her fingers brushed the porch railing as she passed, tracing the grooves her mother used to sand every spring. Habit, muscle memory. But when she opened the door, it wasn't her mother who stood inside. Robert, her father, or what passed for him. He stood in the front hall like a sentry, arms crossed, face carved from stone. He didn't flinch when he saw her. No words. No embrace, just a nod. "You're late." Charlotte's voice cracked before it reached her throat. "When did it happen?" 2 nights ago." His tone was flat final. "Burial was yesterday morning." She froze. "You buried her without me?" Robert's gaze flicked toward the window, then back. He didn't blink. "You weren't here." Her knees buckled inward, but she stayed upright. Rage and disbelief warred silently inside her ribcage. Then another voice, too familiar, too smug, called from the hallway. "Guess you shouldn't have left, huh?" Caleb, her half-brother. Same father, different mother. Always different. He appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. Taller than she remembered. Lean, sharp around the edges. His grin didn't reach his eyes. "We handled it." Charlotte stepped back instinctively. "What are you doing here?" Caleb tossed the rag onto the table like it offended him. "Cleaning up, someone has to." She looked past him through the doorway, saw movement boxes stacked against the kitchen walls. The china hutch emptied, her mother's old curtains stuffed into trash bags. Whose idea was this? Dad's, mostly. Caleb shrugged as if boxing up their mother's life was just another weekend chore. "House isn't worth much as is, might as well get it market ready." Charlotte's stomach lurched. "You're selling the farm?" "Yeah." He said it like it was obvious, like it wasn't even a betrayal worth discussing. She turned to Robert, eyes burning. "You're really letting him do this?" Robert's expression didn't shift, not even slightly. "It's already done." For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Charlotte's heartbeat roared in her ears. She forced her voice steady. "And Mom's will." Caleb snorted softly, shaking his head. "What will?" Charlotte's breath hitched. She looked at Robert, his jaw clenched. A pause too long. "It was amended," he said finally, before she passed. "What are you talking about?" Her voice sharpened. "Mom wouldn't—" "She did." Robert cut her off. "Everything was signed, all legal." Charlotte's world tilted. She felt it, like the floor wasn't anchored anymore. "I want to see it," she whispered. Caleb chuckled under his breath. "You can call the lawyer if you want. Won't change the ink." "You're lying," her voice cracked. Caleb stepped closer now, eyes narrowing, voice low and deliberate. "Face it, Charlie. You weren't her favorite. You left. You made her choose." He leaned forward just enough to stab the words in. "And she chose us." Charlotte's hands trembled at her sides. She looked to Robert again, pleading without words, but he didn't move, didn't argue. His silence said it all. She was alone. The kitchen behind Caleb smelled like old lemons and sawdust. The sunlight angled through the dusty curtains onto the floor, same as it always had, and yet nothing felt familiar. Not anymore? Caleb's voice sliced through the quiet casual as if commenting on the weather. You don't have a claim here. You don't belong. Charlotte looked down not at Caleb, not at her father, but at the warped floorboards beneath her boots. She remembered playing there once, chasing stray puppies through the hallways, hearing her mother's laughter echo off these same walls. That felt like another lifetime. She lifted her chin. Her voice was quieter now, but clear. I'm not leaving. Robert answered without missing a beat. Yes, you are. And with that, he turned away. Caleb watched her for a moment longer, his smirk flickering, then followed. Their footsteps faded down the hall. Charlotte stood alone in the front entryway, breathing shallow, her palms slick with sweat. The boxes in the kitchen loomed. Dust hung motionless in the sunbeams. Her mother's house, her house now felt like a stranger. Charlotte didn't move. Couldn't. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at nothing, listening to the silence swallow her whole. Outside, a crow cawed, once sharp and distant. When Charlotte finally stepped forward, it wasn't toward the kitchen or the stairs or the living room where she used to sit beside her mother on winter mornings. She stepped outside, into the cold, and let the door close behind her. The office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. Charlotte stood just inside the door, uncertain whether to sit or run. She hadn't seen David Merrick in over a year, not since her mother's last surgery. Back then, his cluttered office felt like a place where answers lived. Now it felt like a waiting room for bad news. He didn't rise to greet her. Instead, David stayed hunched over his desk, flipping through a thin brown file folder. His hair, once thick and iron gray, was thinning, now his shoulders stooped as though carrying something heavier than age. When he finally spoke, his voice was apologetic before the words even landed. I wish you'd come sooner, Charlotte. She ignored the implication, stepping forward stiffly. Just show me the paperwork. He hesitated, eyes flickering, but then he slid the folder across the desk, slow and careful, like he was passing a loaded weapon. Charlotte reached for it with steady hands she didn't feel. Inside, 3 sheets of legal stationery, her mother's signature, witness lines, a notary stamp that gleamed under the flickering office light. She read the title aloud, her voice flat, Revised Last Will and Testament of Margaret Lawson. Her throat closed. She forced herself to keep reading. Her mother's land, the house, the savings account, every line item Charlotte knew by heart. She remembered long nights spent beside her mother at the kitchen table discussing which charities would benefit from the estate. Discussions about preserving the animal rescue, about the house never being sold, about protecting what mattered. Except none of that was here. Instead, every asset listed beneath 2 names. Robert Lawson, Caleb Lawson. Nothing for her. Charlotte looked up sharply. What the hell is this? David didn't answer. His hands trembled where they rested on the desk. This isn't right. Her voice cracked now, fury bleeding in. Mom would never... She signed it. David's voice was small. I was there. No. She stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the worn floor. She talked to me about this. She made plans. This isn't possible. I tried to reach you after she passed Charlotte. I called. Why didn't you tell me they changed the will? I didn't know until they brought me the revised copy. 2 weeks before she died. Charlotte froze. 2 weeks. Her mother had been in hospice by then. Weak, fading, barely lucid. Her voice fell to a whisper. She wouldn't have understood what she was signing. David's silence answered that for her. Charlotte backed away, heart racing, pulse hammering against her ribs. She felt the betrayal crack her open from the inside. You're telling me my mother disinherited me from her deathbed? David said nothing. Charlotte laughed, but it wasn't humor, it was disbelief, hollow and ragged. Where's the original will? He glanced down at his desk. Revoked. By who? She snapped. By your mother. Charlotte swore under her breath, pacing now, hands shaking. I want a forensic review of her signature. I want every damn witness questioned. David's eyes flicked up. Charlotte, I want proof, she hissed, or I'll take them both to court for fraud. A new voice interrupted from behind. You'll lose. Charlotte spun around. Robert stood in the doorway, arms crossed, blocking the exit like a wall. He wore the same expression he had when she was 8 years old and broke the porch light disappointment but without affection. Dad! Robert stepped inside his presence, swallowing the small office hole. Margaret signed that will, Charlotte. You don't want to believe it, but she did. That's not possible. She knew what she was doing. Charlotte's voice rose, anger unraveling restraint. She was dying. Robert didn't flinch, and she was clear-headed. She turned to David, pleading now. Tell him! David stared down at the folder, saying nothing. Charlotte's heart cracked. Robert's voice dropped lower, colder. You think she didn't notice the way you pulled away? Moving out, missing holidays, bringing strangers to the house. You embarrassed her. Her voice caught. I never left her. Robert stepped closer. She thought you didn't care. Charlotte's body sagged under the weight of that lie, a deeper betrayal than ink on a page. Robert delivered the final blow without blinking. She wanted peace before she died. You weren't part of that. Charlotte shook her head slowly. I don't believe you. Then from the corner, another voice. You should. Caleb. He leaned against the doorframe, casual, like none of this mattered. She chose Dad. She chose me. Charlotte's knees almost buckled. Caleb shrugged, his grin sharp. Why do you think she never called you at the end? The air in the room collapsed. Charlotte barely registered Robert stepping aside. Caleb's smirk. David's silence. She couldn't hear over the rushing sound in her ears. Robert delivered the last quiet sentence like a verdict. You have nothing here anymore. Charlotte looked down at the folder still lying open on the desk. Her mother's signature glared back at her. The paper felt heavier than stone. She spoke once more, but not to them. I'm going to find the truth. And then she walked past them both out of the office into the cold morning air. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Charlotte didn't knock when she reached the house. She pushed the door open hard enough that it rattled against the wall. Her boots dragged dust into the hallway, but she didn't care. Not anymore. She found Robert in the kitchen. Same place as always. Same man, too. He was standing by the old sink polishing a chipped coffee mug with more attention than he'd ever given her. The morning light sliced through the cracked window pane, catching the edge of his profile, hard jaw, colder eyes. Charlotte's voice cut the silence. You stole everything. Robert didn't turn. I didn't steal what was already mine. She stepped closer, trembling with fury she could barely contain. Don't say that. Not when you know. I know your mother signed that will. He said it flat dead, and I know you weren't there when she needed you. Charlotte's breath faltered just long enough for him to continue. You ran off to your little city life, left the farm, left her. I left because of you, Charlotte snapped. Because you made this house a grave before she even died. Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He never argued, not when silence could hurt more. Charlotte took another step, standing now just a few feet from the man who had taught her that strength meant never asking for affection. Why? Her voice cracked raw. Why do this? Finally, Robert turned. His gaze met hers, cold, unreadable. Because you're not like her. Charlotte froze. She wanted quiet. Your noise, your complication. That's not true. Robert shrugged. She said so herself. No. She wanted peace at the end, Charlotte. His tone sharpened like a blade twisting in the wound. And peace didn't look like you. Charlotte staggered back as if struck. Behind her footsteps. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Caleb's voice echoed lazily from the doorway. Why are you still here, Charlie? Charlotte turned slowly. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, smug grin in place, as if this were all some long-running joke and she was the only one not laughing. She swallowed, fighting to find her voice. I'm going to court? Caleb laughed. Actually laughed. For what hurt feelings? Charlotte's face burned. You forged that will? Caleb's grin widened, shark-like. Prove it. Charlotte's hands curled into fists at her sides. I will. Robert spoke behind her, low and final. You're wasting your time. Charlotte spun back to face him, tears she refused to let fall burning behind her eyes. I'm not wasting anything. You took everything, and I won't let you sell what's left of her. Robert watched her for a long moment. Then, calm as a man discussing the weather, he said, She gave up on you before she died? Charlotte's breath shattered in her chest. She wanted Caleb to carry her name forward. She told me. Liar. Believe what you want. Silence. Robert turned away, pouring himself coffee like nothing had happened. He spoke over his shoulder, disinterested now, as if she were already fading. Go ahead, file your suit. Drag the family name through court if that makes you feel better. Charlotte's voice came low, fierce. This isn't about feeling better. This is about truth. From behind, Caleb snorted. Good luck finding it. Charlotte turned back to him. I'll find it in court. He shook his head, laughing softly. You still don't get it, do you? Get what? Caleb leaned forward, slightly, voice dropping. You're an outsider here, always have been. Charlotte flinched. That farm, this house, even Mom's name, none of it's yours anymore. His next words came like a death sentence. You're nothing but a guest who overstayed. Charlotte didn't reply. Couldn't. She felt the walls close in. Her fists trembled. Her throat burned. She wanted to scream, to shatter the coffee mug from Robert's hand, to wipe the smugness off Caleb's face, to do anything but stand there and be swallowed by their indifference. But then slowly she breathed, long and steady. She straightened her spine, forced the fury back into her bones where it belonged. And her voice, when it came, was quiet. I'll see you in court. Neither man stopped her as she walked out. She didn't look back. Not once. The courthouse wasn't as grand as Charlotte remembered. The bricks were chipped, the flags hung limp in the wind. Even the steps leading to the double doors felt smaller now, like the place had shrunk, or maybe she had grown too tired to care. But the crowd outside hadn't shrunk. Not today. She parked half a block away to avoid them. Reporters, neighbors, curious locals who once brought their dogs to her clinic now gathered like vultures with microphones instead of talons. She could hear the whispers even before stepping from the truck. "That's Margaret Lawson's girl. Didn't even show up for the funeral, I heard. Greedy, just like her father said." Charlotte kept walking. The rain had started early, fine, cold, relentless. It soaked through her jacket before she crossed the square. Her heels echoed against the stone steps as she climbed head down, breath steady. The courthouse doors loomed like an accusation, and still she walked inside. Courtroom 3 smelled like mildew and old wood polish. She sat alone. Robert and Caleb sat 3 benches ahead, their attorney chatting amiably beside them. Caleb lounged confident as ever, flipping a pen between his fingers. Robert sat motionless, his hands folded neatly on his knee, staring at nothing. Charlotte had no one. No sister, no friend, not even a paralegal. Her lawyer had warned her. Without proof of coercion or fraud, this case won't survive the first hearing. But Charlotte didn't care. Not then, not after everything. The hearing started at 9 sharp. Judge Harlow presided. Gray-haired, stern, impatient, Charlotte rose when her name was called. Her voice wavered only once as she spoke. She told the court her mother was manipulated, forced to sign a revised will while sedated in hospice care. She spoke of Robert's control, Caleb's lies, the disinheritance, the betrayal. But all she had were words. Their attorney countered easily. He presented the will, the notarized signature, the witnesses who would affirm her mother's full mental capacity at the time of signing. Legal binding final. Charlotte tried to object, tried to explain the impossibility, the conversations, the promises her mother made, the history no document could erase. Judge Harlow cut her off. "The burden of proof rests on you, Miss Lawson. You have presented no concrete evidence." Charlotte's lawyer barely spoke. He knew better. She didn't. She kept fighting desperation bleeding into her voice, ignoring every shake of her lawyer's head. At one point, she caught Caleb's eyes. He smiled. Time blurred after that. When the judge finally said the words, they felt distant. Case dismissed. Charlotte didn't react. She stood there in the middle of the courtroom watching papers shuffle. People stand, doors creak open. Caleb slapped Robert on the back as they walked past her. Their attorney laughed at some joke she didn't catch. She just stood. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. It poured now, heavy drumming against the pavement. Charlotte stepped into it without flinching. Her lawyer caught up at the steps. "I'm sorry, Charlotte." She didn't answer. "You did what you could." Still nothing. "You should let it go." That's when she turned. Her eyes weren't teary. They were hollow. "Let it go?" He hesitated. "Sometimes there's nothing left to fight." She looked past him through the rain to where Caleb and Robert were loading into their truck, laughing. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Not yet." She walked away before he could answer. She walked past the cameras, past the neighbors' stares, past the whispers. She kept walking until her legs gave out. And then, for the first time that day, she let herself fall. Knees to pavement, rain soaking her hair, hands trembling. And yet, even as her body shook, even as grief choked her breath, her eyes, those sharp, hollow eyes, shifted. From grief to something colder, something harder. The next time they saw her, she wouldn't be fighting for memories. She'd be fighting for proof. And she wouldn't lose twice. The clinic was silent when Charlotte returned. She didn't bother turning on the lights. Rainwater still clung to her jacket, trailing droplets across the linoleum floor as she moved slow and automatic past the empty reception desk down the narrow hallway and into exam room 3. Inside, a small dog whimpered softly in the corner cage. She'd found him 2 nights before, half-starved, ribs like fingers pressing against his skin, eyes too big for a face that thin. Someone dumped him near the train tracks like he'd been cargo that wasn't worth the wait. No collar, no chip, no name. Just one more stray trying to survive. Charlotte knelt in front of the cage, now resting her forehead against the cool metal bars, her breath shaky. "I know the feeling," she whispered. The dog crept forward, hesitant. His nose brushed her fingers. She opened the door. He didn't bolt. He just pressed himself against her knees, shaking, as if instinct told him fight or trust. And tonight, trust was easier. She lifted him gently, wrapping his frail body inside the dry half of her jacket. He didn't resist. In the quiet, Charlotte moved toward the counter. Her hands knew the motions before her brain did. Gauze, antiseptic, syringe, saline drip. Routine. Control. the one place they couldn't take from her. She worked in silence save for the occasional soft whimper from the dog. Each wound cleaned, each rib checked. IV started. She whispered nonsense words the same way her mother once whispered to orphan pups in this same clinic. And when it was done, she sat beside the table back against the cabinets, the small dog curled against her side, his thin body rising and falling in slow, exhausted breaths. Outside, the rain tapped steady against the windows. Charlotte stared ahead at nothing. Her mind wasn't empty. It was calculating. Voiceover. They think the only thing I lost was love. She looked down at the animals sleeping against her. They're wrong. A pause. Slow inhale. I didn't lose love. I lost the right to pretend they cared. Silence settled. Then her voice sharpened. If I can't win this with heart, I'll win it with truth. The dog shifted slightly, burrowing closer. She didn't move. She was somewhere else now. Not in the clinic. Not in this town. In her mind, she stood in front of that courtroom again, but this time the outcome was different. This time, Robert didn't smirk. Caleb didn't lean back relaxed. This time, the judge didn't dismiss her. Because this time, she'd bring evidence. Real evidence. Not accusations. Not heartbreak. Facts. Charlotte stood slowly, the movement careful so as not to disturb the sleeping stray. She placed him gently in a recovery kennel, draped a warm towel over his back, and secured the latch. Then she walked to her office. For the first time that day, she turned on the light. The glow was harsh fluorescent but necessary. She crossed to her desk. Her fingers didn't hesitate. Laptop open, browser loaded, search bar blinking. She typed 3 words. Private, financial, investigation. Hundreds of results. She clicked past the ads, past the sponsored scams. She wasn't looking for subtlety. She was looking for aggression. Scrolling, clicking. Then she found it. Hawthorne Risk Management. Discreet, comprehensive, ruthless. She skimmed their site. White-collar fraud, asset tracing, estate litigation support. She didn't need promises. She needed results. A direct number flashed at the bottom of the page. She dialed. 1 ring. 2. A woman answered, sharp, professional. Hawthorne Risk. This is Danielle. Charlotte's throat was dry. Her voice cracked slightly. My name is Charlotte Lawson. I need to speak to someone about financial fraud. Family estate. A pause, not hesitation. Processing. Danielle's tone shifted instantly. Yes, ma'am. Are you in immediate danger? No. Good. Are you the estate executor? No. Are you contesting a will? Charlotte's jaw tightened. I'm preparing to. Silence. Then Danielle again. We can help. Charlotte closed her eyes, exhaled. Danielle continued brisk. I'll connect you to our forensic accounting lead. First consult is confidential. Non-disclosure is standard. You'll need to provide any financial documents or property transfers you can access. I'll have them. Good. A pause. One last question, Miss Lawson. Charlotte opened her eyes. Yes. Danielle's voice cool but kind. Do you want recovery or retribution? Charlotte didn't answer. She didn't need to. The line clicked as the transfer connected. Charlotte sat back in her chair and smiled. It wasn't kind. It wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who had finally chosen war. Charlotte didn't sleep much after the call. 2 days later, a man named Lucas Pierce showed up at her clinic. He didn't carry a briefcase. No suit, just dark jeans, scuffed boots, and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen too many winters. He didn't smile either. I'm from Hawthorne Risk. Charlotte nodded once wordless, then led him to the back office. She pulled the door closed. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was professional. Lucas wasted no time. You believe Caleb Lawson's hiding assets? I know he is. He watched her carefully. His voice was steady, clinical. Knowing and proving aren't the same thing. Charlotte's voice was cold. That's why you're here. Lucas cracked a thin smile at that. Just for a second. Fair enough. She slid the file across the table. Every document she had copies of Caleb's property, claims, public deeds, tax filings, witness statements from the trial. All clean, all calculated. Lucas flipped through them slowly, eyes sharp. He's good. Charlotte said nothing. Lucas looked up, but not perfect. And that's when everything started. Hawthorne Risk didn't wait. Over the next 72 hours, Lucas and his team moved like shadows through the financial underworld Caleb didn't know he'd exposed himself to. Shell companies, dummy accounts, land parcels shuffled through middlemen, but money left footprints, and Lucas knew how to follow them. On the 4th day, Charlotte's burner phone lit up at 2:37 a.m. Lucas. She didn't bother with hello. Talk. His voice came low, certain. We found something. She sat up in bed, heart racing. Caleb has 2 LLCs registered out of state. Both list him as a silent partner. That's impossible. It gets worse. Those companies jointly own 3 properties. One of them, Lucas paused, then finished carefully, is the farm. Charlotte's chest tightened. No, the farm deed transferred to my father. Legally, yes. But last month, Robert Lawson sold the holding rights to a company called Marrow Creek Investments. Charlotte's head spun. And Caleb controls Marrow Creek. Silent partner, 51%. Her breath left her in a single hollow exhale. Lucas continued. They're shopping it. Your brother's been meeting with developers from Evermere Group. Large-scale commercial project. They're looking to build an event resort. No. Lucas was silent. He's selling it, Charlotte whispered. He's selling the farm. Lucas didn't say what both of them knew. That's why they'd buried her in court. Why Robert never fought. Why Caleb smiled. Because it had never been about the farm. It had been about the sale. Charlotte's voice cracked. How much? Initial bid from Evermere is $6.8 million. Her knees buckled. She sat down hard on the floor phone, clutched against her ear. Lucas pressed on. Caleb's planning to sign by end of month. Can you prove it? Lucas didn't hesitate. I already have. An encrypted file landed in Charlotte's inbox before sunrise. She opened it without breathing. Emails. Draft contracts. Bank transfer templates. A full map of Caleb's hidden empire. Every asset. Every lie. Charlotte scrolled slowly, eyes burning. This wasn't greed. This wasn't desperation. It was betrayal premeditated and cold. Her mother's land. Her childhood home. The rescue center. Everything Charlotte thought she'd lost to grief had already been sold in Caleb's mind. And soon in reality. But not yet. Not yet. When dawn crept over the horizon, Charlotte was still sitting there, file-open laptop glowing against her pale face. And her hands for the first time in weeks weren't shaking. She was steady. She was steel, Lucas called once more. What's the play? Charlotte stared at the screen at the proof of everything Caleb thought he'd buried. And her voice when it came was quieter than he expected. We burned them. She closed the laptop and began building the fire. Charlotte didn't send the files right away. She studied them first. Line after line. Dollar after dollar. Shell companies. Bank transfers. Caleb's fingerprints pressed everywhere he believed he'd wiped clean. The kind of fraud Robert Lawson wouldn't have even understood, but Caleb had known exactly what he was doing. He'd waited for their mother to die. He'd waited for Charlotte to grieve. And then he'd sold their future. Charlotte sat in the dark office of her clinic, lit only by the glow of her laptop, staring at the crime her family thought she'd never see. They thought she'd mourn. Instead, she calculated. By noon, she had her list. Not reporters. Not the press releases Caleb's attorney would expect. No. Charlotte sent the files to the people who would hurt them. Most bloggers, independent journalists, small-town gossip sites. Not the national outlets, the locals. The ones who knew the farm. The ones who cared about the land. The ones who had nothing to lose. She attached everything. Scans of the contracts. The hidden LLC trail. The proposed resort plans. And at the bottom of every email, one sentence. This is how they sold out Margaret Lawson's legacy. She hit send and waited. The first article dropped within 4 hours. By the 8th hour, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She watched the storm build in real time. Headlines spread like wildfire. Local heir selling family farmland to resort giant. Betrayal in plain sight, Lawson family's secret sale. Margaret Lawson's rescue ranch to become wedding venue. In forums, people raged. Margaret Lawson was beloved here. People remembered her bringing rescued horses into town for kids' parades, remembered her speaking at school fundraisers, her quiet generosity, her laugh. They didn't forgive betrayal. Not this. By midnight, Save Margaret's Farm trended across the region. And Evermere Group noticed. The corporation's PR department moved faster than Charlotte expected. At 10:06 the next morning, Evermere released a public statement. In light of recent revelations concerning ownership disputes and community concerns, Evermere Group is terminating all purchase negotiations regarding the Lawson property effective immediately. Charlotte read the press release 3 times. She didn't smile. She just sat still and waited. Because she knew what was coming next. It arrived that evening. At 9:37 p.m., long after the clinic closed, Charlotte was locking the side door when the silhouette stepped from behind the feed barrels. Robert! He said nothing at first, just stood there half in shadow, arms loose at his sides like dead weight. Charlotte didn't flinch. He stepped forward once slow. I should have expected this. His voice was hoarse, not weak, not angry, just resigned. But that was Robert's specialty. Sounding like disappointment was inevitable. Charlotte met his gaze. I'm sure Caleb's handling it worse. Robert's jaw twitched. He didn't deny it. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then Robert asked softly, Why Charlotte? She laughed dry and hollow. You're serious. You didn't have to do this. No, Charlotte said. But you did. He stepped closer, voice tightening. You ruined your brother. No, Charlotte corrected coldly. He did that himself. Robert's expression cracked then just for a second. enough for her to see something behind the exhaustion. Not guilt, not regret. Fear. He was afraid. She wondered when the last time was that Robert Lawson had been scared. Probably the day Margaret signed her first will. Robert shifted his stance, forcing steel back into his voice. "You're making enemies you don't understand." Charlotte's voice was ice. "No, Dad. I'm finally understanding exactly who my enemies are." Robert's mouth opened, then closed. She stepped past him, deliberate. He didn't stop her. Didn't even turn. When she reached the door, she paused. "You taught me silence meant strength." Robert said nothing. Charlotte looked back over her shoulder, voice low and final. "You were wrong." And then she locked the door behind her. Inside, her clinic smelled like antiseptic and fresh hay. Home. Outside, Robert Lawson stood in the dark, finally alone. The rain was long gone, but the mud still clung to Robert's boots when he stepped inside Charlotte's clinic. He didn't knock. Charlotte heard the door creak, but didn't look up. She was standing by the back counter, carefully replacing the files from Hawthorne Risk back into their sealed envelope, methodical, precise. Her fingers never trembled now. Only when she finished, only when the last document was safe, did she lift her gaze. Robert stood there in the doorway, a silhouette of the man who raised her, the same broad frame, the same unreadable eyes, but hollow now, stripped bare. Neither of them spoke. Until he did. "You think this ends with you winning?" Charlotte's voice came like stone. "I think it ends with you losing." He stepped further into the clinic, past the exam tables where she'd once sat as a child, legs swinging, listening to her mother explain how to care for an injured hawk. Robert's voice dropped harsher now. "You've destroyed this family." Charlotte met his stare without flinching. "I didn't destroy anything. I just refused to be buried inside it." Robert's eyes flickered. "I'm warning you, girl." "No," Charlotte said softly. "You're threatening me." Her grip tightened around the file folder in her hand. She didn't hide it. She wanted him to see. Robert's gaze dropped to the envelope, and for the first time, Charlotte saw it. Fear. Real. Tangible. The silence between them wasn't just heavy now, it was suffocating. Then Robert spoke slower. Measured. But something in his voice cracked. "You'll regret this." Charlotte stepped forward. "I might regret a lot of things." She paused. Let him hear the stillness in her voice. "But not this." Robert's jaw clenched. He took one step closer, as if proximity could still unnerve her, like when she was 16, when silence was punishment. But she didn't move. She stood steady, the sealed file in her hand like a verdict. "You're making a mistake, Charlotte." "No." Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't waver. "You are." Robert's breath hitched. He hadn't expected that. Charlotte's voice softened, but it was lethal now. "I spent years trying to be the daughter you wanted." A long pause. "And you spent years making me regret that." Neither of them moved. Neither looked away. Outside wind pressed against the windows, but inside the air didn't stir. Then slowly Charlotte lifted the file slightly, just enough for Robert to see the weight of it. The inevitability. "I know everything." Robert's throat worked once. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not guilt, not shame. Recognition. Charlotte continued cold. "Caleb's sale, the shell companies, the fake holding accounts." She leaned in, voice low. "I have it all." Robert's mask shattered. "You think this makes you strong?" Charlotte's voice was a razor. "No." She stepped past him. "I've always been strong." At the door she paused. "And for the first time you're afraid of it." Robert turned then, too late. Charlotte didn't spare him another glance. She walked out, the file clutched firm in her hand, her steps echoing behind her. And Robert Lawson stood alone in the clinic his wife once built, watching his daughter leave not as a girl, but as the reckoning he never saw coming. The conference room smelled like paper and nerves. Charlotte sat at the far end of the long table, arms folded tight, the sealed evidence file resting in front of her like a silent threat. Around her, local council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their glances uneasy. No one spoke. The lawyer she'd hired, the third one, stood beside her now. Amelia Grant. Sharp voice, sharper mind. The kind of woman who didn't believe in soft landings. "This isn't a trial," Amelia said flatly, cutting through the silence. "It's a public hearing. You know what that means." Charlotte nodded once, but said nothing. "It means you'll win the audience before you win the council." Charlotte's voice was low. "I'm not here for applause." Amelia allowed herself a small grim smile. "Good, because there won't be any." Papers rustled. Someone coughed at the far end of the table. "This hearing exposes their fraud publicly." Amelia continued, her tone professional but relentless. "But don't expect confessions. Expect escalation." "I'm ready." "Are you?" Charlotte didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on the folder. At the edge of the table, one council member, an older man, Charlotte vaguely remembered from school fundraisers her mother used to organize, cleared his throat. "Miss Lawson," he said, eyes soft but cautious, "you understand what you're accusing your family of?" She met his gaze steady. I'm not accusing. She placed the file on the table. Her fingers spread over it protectively. I'm proving. Silence. Then Amelia's voice sliced through. She's telling the truth, and we'll prove it at the hearing. The councilman looked down at the table, defeated. That farm meant a lot to this town. I know. And you're ready to bury your father in front of everyone. Charlotte's breath hitched, but her answer came clear. He buried me first. No one asked another question. The strategy session ended without handshakes. Charlotte stood slowly gathering the evidence, the weight of the document suddenly heavier than the sum of their pages. When she stepped outside into the autumn air, the sun had already dipped behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She paused. Let the silence settle around her. And for the first time in weeks, memory took her. It came unbidden, soft but sharp, like the sting of a scar reopening. Her mother's hand. Cool. Trembling. Wrapped weakly around hers in that sterile hospital room where machines beeped too slowly and the air smelled like surrender. She remembered the IV in her mother's wrist. The frailness. The way Margaret Lawson had looked at her not as a child, but as an equal. Don't let them silence you. Charlotte had shaken her head, crying, then not caring who saw. Mom, I'm tired. Her mother's voice weaker than Charlotte had ever heard, but more certain than her father had ever sounded. Don't be quiet just because they are. Her grip had tightened briefly. And then, silence. Charlotte opened her eyes. The parking lot returned. The courthouse. The waiting fight. Her mother was gone. But her voice remained. Charlotte adjusted the folder under her arm and stepped forward, her pace measured. Each step felt deliberate now. Not away from grief, but toward justice. She whispered the last thing her mother had ever said to her, not for comfort. For promise. Don't be silent when you know you're right. Charlotte's fingers flexed around the folder. And for the first time, she wasn't carrying her mother's legacy. She was defending it. Publicly, and without fear. Charlotte stood behind the wooden podium, her fingers pressed flat against the surface, steady now. The council chamber smelled of old carpet and sweat, packed with bodies too tense to breathe properly. Every seat was full. Along the back wall, cameras rolled silently, local news stations, independent bloggers, even a few from nearby cities who smelled scandal. It wasn't a trial, but it felt like one. She saw Robert 2 rows from the front, his arms folded, face like stone. Caleb sat beside him, twitchy, his knee bouncing under the table, glancing at his lawyer every 30 seconds like a child hoping for a parent to intervene. No one could. Not today. Charlotte didn't start with anger. She started with facts. She clicked the remote, and behind her, the projection screen flickered to life. Document scans filled the air. Emails, bank records, property transfers, all watermarked with the seal of Hawthorne Risk. The first 5 minutes were clinical, cold, methodical. She traced every shell company, every forged document, every LLC Caleb created to bury the farm inside layers of paperwork he thought no one would notice. They noticed now. She showed the proposed Evermere sale. She read aloud the projected $6.8 million payout Caleb would have received. And she paused. Let that silence ring. The council members shifted in their seats. The townspeople murmured. Reporters scribbled furiously. Charlotte looked up from her notes. Her voice when it came was sharper than before. Not trembling, not angry. Just surgical. For months they told you I was the bitter one. She met Robert's gaze directly. He didn't blink. They said I walked away from this family, that I abandoned what mattered. She looked at Caleb, his jaw tightened. But what they really wanted, she paused, was for me to stay silent. Charlotte laid the final document flat on the podium, a forensic report on their mother's signature. This is not my mother's hand. She let the audience see the analysis. Ink patterns, tremor inconsistencies, the overwhelming conclusion. Signature likely forged. A gasp rippled through the room. Finally, Charlotte looked out across the audience. This isn't about land. Her voice cracked, but not from weakness. This is about trust. Caleb moved first. His voice cracked too, but from panic. She's lying. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, tried to steady him. Failed. She's making this sound worse than it is. Charlotte didn't turn. She kept facing forward. You hid my mother's will, she said quietly. You falsified her signature while she was too weak to write her own name. Caleb half stood, pointing, desperate now. You don't know what Mom wanted. The council chair slammed his gavel. Mr. Lawson, you are out of order. But Charlotte kept speaking, her voice now soft enough the room had to lean in. She wanted me to fight. Caleb's mouth worked, but no sound came. His lawyer sat down. Robert said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply bowed his head. In that moment, Charlotte understood. He wasn't defending Caleb anymore. He wasn't defending himself. He had nothing left to defend. Her lawyer stood beside her now, but said nothing. There was no need. Charlotte closed the presentation. The truth is simple, she said. You don't need to believe me. You just need to believe the evidence. A pause. And then, for the first time, it speaks louder than their silence. The room was still. 1 second. 2. Then came the sound Charlotte least expected. Applause. It started small. One person. Then another. Then the whole chamber. Not polite, not hesitant. Real. Charlotte stepped back from the podium. She didn't smile. She just breathed. At last. Robert didn't look up. Caleb didn't stand. But Charlotte did. And this time the whole town stood with her. Robert found her in the hallway after the hearing, leaning against the stone wall, exhausted but upright. Charlotte. She didn't look at him. What do you want? His voice was smaller than she'd ever heard it. What now? She turned slow, deliberate, looked him straight in the eye. Now. He nodded, swallowing hard. You've got the town, the council. You've got whatever you came for. Her silence pressed him further. What's left? You want the farm back. His voice cracked. Is that it? Charlotte let the words hang. Then softly, too softly, she answered. No. Robert blinked, stunned. No, I don't want the farm. He stared, confusion breaking past the weight of everything else. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Charlotte's voice didn't waver. I don't want the land. Her gaze dropped for just a second, her voice raw now, not from weakness, but finality. I want it to mean something. Robert's brows furrowed. Charlotte stepped closer. I filed the paperwork, she said quietly, but her words were knives. The property, every acre, every structure, every right of way, it's not mine. She paused. It never will be. Robert shook his head, slightly unable to process. Charlotte's eyes glinted. It belongs to the Pine Creek Wildlife Rescue Foundation. Robert froze. What? Charlotte didn't repeat herself. She let him feel it. Feel the weight of it. The farm. His father's inheritance. Her mother's legacy. All of it. Gone. To the animals Margaret Lawson once loved more than the people who shared her last name. Charlotte's voice was softer now. That's what Mom wanted. Robert staggered back half a step. Why would you? Because the land was hers. Charlotte's tone sharpened. Not angry, just absolute. And because you don't get to sell it. Robert shook his head as if disbelief alone could undo it. You could have taken it back. You could have sold it yourself. Taken the money. Charlotte's next words were almost a whisper. I didn't fight for money. Robert met her eyes, and this time she saw it. The breaking. The end of him. I fought for her. Neither of them moved. The hallway echoed empty. Finally, Robert's shoulders slumped. He didn't speak. Didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Charlotte stepped around him without looking back. She kept walking until the courthouse doors opened, and the sunlight hit her face. The decision wasn't revenge. It was release. The for sale sign came down first. 2 men in reflective vests pried it from the ground just after sunrise. Caleb watched from the edge of the dirt road, hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched like he was bracing for a blow that never came. The wind rattled the rusted gate behind him, the sound hollow, empty. The realtors were efficient. One man coiled the chain. Another folded the sign neatly into the back of a pickup. Within minutes, there was no evidence the Lawson farm had ever been for sale. Only the land remained, but it wasn't theirs anymore. Caleb stayed standing long after the trucks pulled away. Behind him, the farmhouse windows looked darker than usual, though he wasn't sure if that was the morning light or something else. Maybe it was him. Maybe the house could tell. His legs gave out eventually. He didn't even notice when it happened, only felt the gravel scrape against his knees as he sank down sitting in the dirt like a kid who'd lost his ball. But he hadn't lost a game. He'd lost everything. He pressed his fists to his eyes hard, but the tears came anyway. In town, the headlines ran thick and brutal. From respected legacy to local disgrace. Lawson family fraud exposed. Daughter's courage saves Margaret's farm. Social media tore them apart faster than the courts ever could. Comment sections overflowed. Neighbors posted childhood photos with Margaret, recalling her kindness, her laughter. Then inevitably, the comparisons followed. She deserved better than a son like Caleb. Robert let it happen. They don't deserve to set foot on that land again. They wouldn't. Robert Lawson didn't read the news. He didn't need to. He could feel it. At first, he thought the silence after the hearing would pass, that it was temporary, like most storms. But storms pass. This silence stayed. The house echoed now. The creak of the porch swing was louder without conversation to drown it out. The hum of the fridge replaced the sound of his wife's voice. Even his own footsteps sounded foreign. He stopped using the front room. The emptiness there was too sharp. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table. Day after day. Chair scraped back. Elbows on wood scarred from decades of coffee mugs and grocery lists. He didn't look at the property transfer documents Charlotte had filed. He didn't need to. The land was gone. So was Caleb. The boy had packed a bag and disappeared 2 nights after the hearing. No goodbye. No confrontation. Just silence. Robert stayed behind. Not because he was waiting, But because he had nowhere left to go, the farm had always been his currency, his control. Without it, he was just an old man sitting at a table where no one would join him. Outside the window, the barn's paint flaked a little more each day. Inside, Robert breathed and waited. For what he didn't know, Caleb never came back, and no one asked if Robert was still there. The clinic smelled different now, not just of antiseptic and old linoleum, but of something quieter, like starting over. Charlotte unlocked the door that morning without hesitation. The weight that had sat on her chest for months, years maybe, was still there but dull now, manageable, familiar but no longer suffocating. The rescue dogs were stirring behind their kennels, the soft whimpering, the eager scraping of paws against metal. Familiar sounds, sounds that made sense. She flicked on the lights, not flinching at their brightness. Today this space belonged to her again. She moved through this morning routine like muscle memory. Water bowls, feeding trays, checking the IV line on the oldest dog Bentley, now 3 weeks into recovery from malnutrition. His tail wagged at her approach, slow but grateful. She scratched his ears gently. "You're tougher than they thought," she whispered. The same thing she could have said to herself. By mid-morning, the little girl arrived. Her name was Sophie. Her mother had called ahead. The child was quiet, anxious, withdrawn. A dog bite 6 months ago, now terrified of animals. Charlotte had said yes without hesitation. Sophie stood hesitantly in the doorway of the exam room, her tiny hands clenched into trembling fists at her sides. The rescue dog Charlotte had chosen, a mottled tan and white mix named Max, stood on the opposite side of the room. Thin, nervous, and barely trusting people himself. Perfect. Charlotte crouched to Sophie's level. "We'll let him decide," Charlotte said softly. "No touching unless he says it's okay. Sound good?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Max's tail flicked once, then twice. Charlotte watched, measured, waited. Sophie extended her palm, trembling. Max crept forward. 1 step, then 2. The child flinched but held her hand steady. Max touched her fingers. It was the smallest of moments, but it cracked something open. Sophie's breath hitched, then released. Her shoulders loosened. Charlotte, from a short distance away, smiled. Just once, quietly. Then her voice returned inside her head, now that voice she'd carried through the hearings, through the long nights, staring at the ceiling. "I spent years hoping they'd change." She watched the child's face shift from fear to wonder. "Hoping if I worked harder, loved harder, they'd choose me." Sophie knelt slowly, Max inching closer, laying his head awkwardly in her lap. "But the people who can't love you won't." Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. "And it isn't your fault." She stood slowly, giving them their moment. This wasn't healing. This was choosing trust after fear. There was a difference. Charlotte knew that now. She returned to the front desk. Let Sophie's mother peer through the window, hands shaking slightly with relief. Let them have that moment without her voice pressing it forward. Instead, Charlotte leaned against the counter and watched the morning sunlight filter across the waiting room floor, turning dust motes into quiet gold. Outside, the town had moved on. The headlines about Robert and Caleb were buried beneath local elections and football scores. People remembered Margaret Lawson's name, but not Charlotte's anymore. Not every day. And that too felt like healing. She had no interest in being the center of someone else's war. Not anymore. The land was gone from her name. The house was empty. Her father hadn't called. Her brother wouldn't. And somewhere in the quiet of that truth, Charlotte felt something settle inside her. Something unfamiliar at first. Not anger. Not grief. Peace. When Sophie's session ended, Charlotte walked her to the door. The girl didn't cling to her mother like before. Instead, she looked back at Max and waved softly. "He's brave," she whispered. Charlotte knelt, brushing a loose strand of hair behind the child's ear. "So are you?" Sophie beamed. Then mother and daughter disappeared out into the late morning light. Charlotte stood at the door a little longer than necessary, watching them walk down the sidewalk, small and safe. Then her voice returned, soft but steady inside her mind. "I thought peace would come when they apologized." She turned back to her clinic, to her quiet, ordinary life. But peace isn't something someone gives you. Max yawned in his crate. It's what you claim when you stop waiting for love that won't come. She walked slowly through the clinic, one hand brushing against the edges of the counters, familiar now. The scars on her wrist from childhood accidents. The faint smell of her mother's old coffee mug that still sat on the back shelf. Margaret wasn't here. She never would be again. But her voice echoed sometimes when the room was quiet enough. "Don't be silent when you know you're right." And Charlotte wasn't silent anymore. She was whole. The clinic didn't need a hero. It needed a vet. And Charlotte finally understood that was enough. She spent the rest of the day with her hands in fur, in gauze, in healing work that didn't require permission or apology. She no longer needed her father's approval, or her brother's acknowledgement. The farm belonged to animals now. And she belonged to herself. When twilight softened the edges of the windows, she sat on the floor beside Max's crate. He crept out slowly, curling beside her without fear. Charlotte rested her hand gently on his back. "You're safe," she whispered. Perhaps finally so was she. The land felt different now. Charlotte stood near the old perimeter fence as the morning mist burned away under the sun, watching the workers shape what once had been called wasted space. Trucks came and went dropping supplies, concrete for foundation pads, timber, wire fencing. They worked in silence, efficient but respectful. This wasn't a job site to them. It was something closer to sacred. The land was changing. The old barns were gone. Only their stone foundations remained half covered by weeds and the ghosts of what had been. The farmhouse too empty, left untouched as a silent monument. But the center was rising. Metal beams, wooden frames, fencing strong enough to hold frightened horses, but open enough that sunlight fell easily through the spaces. Every day more volunteers arrived, some locals who remembered her mother, some strangers who just believed in what Charlotte was building. She didn't give orders. She worked. At sunrise, she hauled lumber. She hammered posts. When the goats arrived early, half wild and terrified, she calmed them herself. No gloves, no hesitation. And when no one was watching sometimes, she stood at the center of it all, breathing deep, memorizing the scent of dust and fresh-cut pine, the low murmur of animals beginning to trust again. This wasn't a rescue center yet. It was a promise. By week's end, they laid the gravel path that curved gently through the heart of the land. Charlotte chose that design herself, a winding route that forced visitors to slow down to notice. Along its edges, saplings were planted, destined to grow into shade trees long after Charlotte was gone. And beside the first sapling, Charlotte planted her own. One tree? A modest oak. Its roots fresh, fragile. She knelt in the dirt beside it, gloveless, her hands stained from the work. No cameras, no audience, just her and the tree. At its base, she placed the plaque, a simple piece of bronze anchored deep into the soil. The inscription read, "Where forgotten lives, find hope." The words weren't hers. They were her mother's. Words Margaret Lawson had written once in a journal Charlotte found after she died. Charlotte had read that line alone in the attic, crying into dust. Now the words belonged here, on this land, where animals would heal, where children would learn, where silence would not be forced. She stood when the last shovelful of earth was pressed around the roots. Then Charlotte stepped back. She didn't touch the plaque again. The tree didn't need her anymore. Across the fields, laughter rose, unrestrained small voices weaving through the air. Children ran past the half-built corrals, their hands outstretched, their feet scattering gravel, as they followed a young rescue dog, brown and white fur blurring as it darted joyfully ahead of them. Max. He belonged here now, too. Charlotte watched without approaching. She didn't need to teach joy. It taught itself. Soft music played from a volunteer's radio somewhere near the tool shed. Gentle acoustic chords blending into birdsong. It wasn't orchestrated. It didn't have to be. This was what peace sounded like. Charlotte found herself standing alone again beside the tree. But this time she didn't feel alone. She felt grounded. Behind her, the shelter kept growing. Hammering, sawing, quiet conversations over feed plans and grant applications, hope stitched together in labor. This wasn't what her father had imagined for the land, nor Caleb, but it was what Margaret Lawson would have wept to see. Charlotte didn't cry. She just breathed and let the future take root. Not as inheritance, but as sanctuary. Charlotte heard the door chime before she saw him. She didn't flinch, not anymore. She just looked up from the reception desk, eyes steady, breath even. Robert Lawson stood framed in the doorway of the clinic, a silhouette outlined by the late afternoon light. The same heavy shoulders, the same weathered face, but smaller now. Fainter somehow, like someone standing too far from his own life. He didn't speak at first, neither did she. Charlotte watched him silent. When Robert finally stepped forward, it wasn't with the authority she remembered. His hands weren't fists now. They hung loose by his sides. "I shouldn't be here," he said, voice rough. She didn't answer. He looked around the clinic, the walls she'd painted herself, the framed photo of the first rescue horse she'd saved. This wasn't the farmhouse. It wasn't even the land. But it was hers. "You did it," Robert said after a long silence. Charlotte said nothing. "You made something out of nothing." His voice cracked then. It didn't sound like admiration. It sounded like surrender. "I thought maybe you'd come home." Charlotte felt the weight of those words settle between them. Then she exhaled softly. "I am home." Robert swallowed hard, shaking his head slightly as if refusing the shape of her answer. "I meant back to the family." A pause. Back to what they were. Back to what he had broken. Charlotte's voice when it came wasn't angry. It was final. "This is my family now." Robert blinked, stunned. These dogs, these people, this work. She stepped around the counter slowly. Her movements measured her presence calm. This is where I belong. Robert opened his mouth, closed it. Charlotte waited. And then softly, almost too soft for him to hear. I kept waiting for you to choose me. She let that linger. And then, I'm done waiting. Robert's shoulders sagged. I was wrong, he said, choking on the admission. Charlotte met his gaze, eyes steady. I know. I thought I was protecting you. No, she said gently. You were protecting yourself. Robert's breath caught. And in that silence, Charlotte felt something inside her loosen. Not forgiveness. Release. Robert took one last step forward, hesitant. I thought... His voice cracked. Whatever sentence he had started, he couldn't finish. I know, Charlotte said again, but this time it wasn't soft. It was closure. Robert didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't apologize again. He just stood there watching the daughter he once thought would always come back. And then she turned, walked past him, toward the kennels, toward the life she'd built. She didn't look back, not even when the door chimed softly behind her as Robert Lawson left. For the last time, the morning came softly. Sunlight dripped golden across the gravel path winding through the new sanctuary, stretching shadows long and slow across the fresh wooden fences. Inside the pens, the animals stirred donkeys, stretching tired legs, rescue horses blinking into dawn dogs, shaking off sleep with soft thumps of tails. And down by the east fence, the children had already arrived. Their voices rang through the air, small but clear, free from hesitation. Miss Charlotte, Miss Charlotte. Charlotte stood near the main gate, one hand shielding her eyes against the brightness of morning. The same worn work boots, the same denim jacket streaked faintly with mud from that morning's feed rounds. She smiled without thinking, simple, easy. When the smallest of the children, a boy no older than 5, threw his arms around her leg, she laughed. The real kind. The sound she hadn't made in years. Easy, buddy, she said gently, crouching down, steadying him. Remember what I said? Gentle hands, he recited proudly, holding up his fingers. That's right. The other kids gathered closer, circling her without fear. Not students, not clients, just children. Just trust. Behind them, Max, the brown and white rescue dog, who once flinched at every human step, trotted along, tongue-out tail, wagging, no longer a shadow of himself. He belonged now. And so did she. Charlotte stood slowly, as the children ran ahead, scattering like birds across the sanctuary's heart. Volunteers opened the pens, hooves kicked up dust. Laughter swirled where not so long ago silence used to sit heavy. The oak tree stood nearby, now taller with every week. Its leaves caught the morning light, and at its base the plaque remained, "Where forgotten lives find hope." Charlotte's gaze softened as she watched one little girl barefoot kneel to read those words out loud to a goat who wasn't listening. Her mother's words. Living here now in wood and earth and air, her voice came quiet and steady, not aloud but inside her as constant as breath. Justice isn't revenge. The kids gathered at the new barn door, small hands gripping fresh wood waiting for her. Justice is when the harm finally ends. Charlotte wiped her hands on her jeans. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. Her voice returned again, calmer now. Justice isn't taking back what was stolen. The children's laughter lifted wind, catching it like a flag. Justice is making sure no one else bleeds the same way. Charlotte knelt as one child tugged her sleeve. Are you coming, Miss Charlotte? She smiled softly. Yeah. A pause. I'm coming. Behind her, the sanctuary stretched wide. Ahead of her, laughter waited. Her voice whispered one final truth as she stepped forward among them, with them no longer outside her own life. Justice is when kindness stops being optional. And then she walked. Into morning. Into peace. Into everything that would come next. Fade out. Music. Silence. And